because he really loved American culture, and he was an intellect, and we could just talk and talk and talk all night, and we saw an early film. And when we left, we felt completely like gobsmacked. I felt like I'd been like hit in the psyche with a sledgehammer, but I also was completely aware of this tension between feeling like every single piece of it was 100% deliberate, but there was so much like nonsensical, sloppy, to use your term, off the rails, like arbitrary feeling. But I knew that David Lynch was too much of a master for that to be accidental. So that's what sort of drove us into this idea that there were actually two different things at work. One is a decoding, and then after you decode it, you can interpret it. The interpretation is personal and up for discussion and debate, but the decoding is the decoding. Mm. So once I got to that place, I started to think about, we kept telling each other the story, we kept discussing, we were having like verbal conversations around the table, and we were just discussing, and we weren't cracking the code because we kept going in circles and it was all nonsensical. We were just telling the movie, and so we couldn't mine for any like deeper symbolism, and we started to smoke a lot of weed, we just kept talking about it, and somehow that helped me separate this idea of narrative versus the symbols. And so right before I went to sleep, and we'd had hours and hours of conversation, what I started to think about, and I didn't know at the time that he was into transcendental meditation, and that he was a fine artist, right? Mm-hmm. But right as I
he went to Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, which is like the most conservative art school in the world.
Yeah, he's like a
which is like,
fine
what?
Artist, totally,
abstract expressionist.
Right,
like,
exactly.
Yeah.
Like feelings. So, but
although his paintings are total garbage, might I just contribute a personal opinion?
Well, why I even brought that up was to think of the mindset, because what I started to do was disengage from this idea that I was like a free-floating intellect that was receiving it and interpreting it, and what I had to understand was I had to either go into the mind of David Lynch, which isn't say equal his mind, it's what would his mind be like. It would be non-linear. It would be comprised of dream states and hallucinations being equal, valid reality to normal reality, like supernatural states of being, like being totally real and accepted as real, right up next to reality, and like and any sort of like shift of consciousness being like a totally legitimate like plot twist, right? So as I was going to sleep, I started to think about that he's actually really daring everyone to go into the meditative mind state in order to find out what it is, to decode it. And I think that's why he resists any interpretation, because he's like, if you're not ready, you're not going to get it, and if you are, you will, and that's meditation. And so talk away, but I have no interest in that. Like, for those who get it, they get it, and they don't, right? So as I was thinking about this going to sleep, I literally, no joke, I went to sleep, I woke up, I shot up in bed and was like, oh my god, he's a genius. Suddenly, like, free-floating from all of the, like, normal academic interpretations that I also have, because I was trained in, a very academic way to interpret and to read and how symbols work. And so, okay, so I'll just start. So,
first, can you tell the group what book you're holding?
Oh,
that your notes were in?
I just found it.
Oh, okay.
Isn't it awesome? It's sort of like we're going to get into something that looks a little bit like this.
But the title of the book is?
The title of the book is, A Primer of Freudian Psychology. I just found it. Totally didn't read it. Okay,
I just
really
thoureally
funny.
that was really appropriate for,
it's so funny.
for where we're
like
going.
I got a stack of books here. That's really funny.
Oh, she's taking us on a journey.
I know. It's really, I'm glad you even noticed it, because I totally didn't notice it. Okay, so the first thing that I realized before I like sketch it out, and I'm gonna like say it as I'm drawing to keep it together, but I did re-watch the film today to just make sure that I had it all right. And it's so funny because now I'm to the point that literally every single word and the exact chronology and every single thing has to happen exactly as it does, or it completely doesn't make sense, which is a totally nonsensical thing to say about this thing. Because I tried to watch it again, like, oh yeah, if I didn't know this, it's like makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, and you can't follow it anyway, and it's totally non-linear, and therefore it just seems like total nonsense. But the first
there's a method to his method.
There's a complete method, and it's actually such a method that once you see it, you can't unsee it. So if anybody's going to be mad at me, like, they want to figure it out for themselves, go now. Because I'm going to be, whoop, and, right?
Yeah, right?
But the thing is,
Yeah, you
it's
guys
so
didn't know what you were in
formal.
for.
No, we did.
It's actually so formal, you'll be like, he's a genius. Like, that's exactly what I had because it's actually so formal. You can grab any part of the film and put it into this, and you're like, it fits, it fits, it fits, it all makes sense, right? So the first thing I realized is just the sort of like the mental key, and I'm going to misspell everything, I really apologize, just shout it out when I do. Narrative is the slave to symbol. Okay, so here's what it explains it, right? Normally in normal like stories, the symbols are just there to give deeper meaning to the narrative, to like work you along, and then you have a symbol, and then you like have a better, deeper like foray into the landscape of what the narrative and the story is telling you, right? He actually flips that inside out. The narrative is almost meaningless. The narrative is whatever the narrative has to be in order to get you to go from symbol to symbol to symbol, to lay it out correctly. And that's why there's this feeling of like, well, the narrative is totally doesn't make sense and is therefore completely not important and could be anything. Because that's true on one side. But it's only because he's actually making the symbols a lot more important than the narrative. So to start with the film, the absolute opening shot, and I'm literally going in the exact chronology of the film. So the opening shot, let me make sure I have this right. Okay.
Wow.
So the opening shot is the road, right? You see the highway, right? And it's just like the fast highway, you're like running down the highway, right? And then the very first character you see is Fred, right? And I give them archetypal names so I can keep them straight because it's actually not about Fred, right? So Fred I refer to as just the jazz man, right?
This is Bill Pullman, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the film opens with the highway. The very first character you meet is Fred. And the very, 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 very first line that happens in the film, and the only piece of information that you start with, is Dick Laurent is dead. Right? And he seems confused and sort of out of sorts, but he doesn't know, and it seems strange, like he doesn't know what's going on, but he just sort of keeps going with the story, and the story moves on. Right? And then we get our first big symbol. And the next big symbol is the videotape. And the videotape is just, sorry. So with the videotape comes the next character, because she's the one who brings it in, which is the wife, right? And I hate to reduce her down to this, but you'll see why it's important later, but she's the brunette version, right? Because there's two, right? Okay, so she brings the videotape. And what the videotape is just the sequence of the house. So that's like on the outskirts of the story, right? So it's creepy, but it's not like directly into the narrative yet. So we keep going on the timeline. But right around this, as they're having the dialogue between Fred and his wife, you see that things are not quite right, and they have this sort of like stunted language between each other, and they're not like relating in a normal way. And he starts to, as they're like waking up and going to sleep and having their lives, the videotapes keep coming, and he starts to tell her things like, you know, that he's seen her in a dream. And so this is where we have to start seeing the alternate states of consciousness come in as like these sort of like narrative catalysts that keep the plot moving. So he's telling her, I had a dream, but it wasn't you, right? So he's having a premonition about his wife, right? And you remember it's that scene where he rolls over and he sees this flash of the scary guy really fast. So that's the like premonition of the wife and what I call the dark man. The dark man, right? So that's where, you know, like we're still dealing with like states of consciousness and weird, like sort of uncanny, out of place, like things that are happening. So they go to the club, he and his wife, right? And I don't know if they are in the club or he's sort of remembering that he's seen his wife, right? Because she's acting sort of strange and he's sort of questioning, like, I'm calling you, you're not there, you're not coming to the club with me, what's going on? And he sort of has this remembrance of her with this guy in the club, the guy with the pencil mustache, and he sees them from afar and they're sort of walking together. So that's the character, Andy, right? But I call him the pimp, right? And so right around here, we're still getting the videotapes every morning, right? And the videotapes are coming in closer and closer to their personal world as the plot unfolds, right? So he starts to ask her, and he's asking her, how do you know this guy? And she has really specific pieces of information she gives him. So she says that she met him at a place called Monk's, and it's for a job she can't remember. Right? So there's still like all this sort of vague, dreamlike, we're not really sure what's going on. So then the very next stage, after this, they keep going, and they go to a party, and that's the very first time that you see the dark man. And he walks up to him, he walks up to Fred, and he has this really creepy interaction where he says, we've met before. And he says, I don't remember, right? So he says, we've met before. Fred says, I don't remember. He says he doesn't remember, right? And he says, where did I meet you? And he says, at your house. And he says, in fact, I'm there right now. So they call the house, and he's there. And he says, the dark man says, I don't go where I'm not invited. And then he asks, who are you? And the man laughs. But I just want to let you know that he says, I met you at your house, don't you remember? Right? So that's a nice, like, perfect little reference to this flash, in this dream state where he doesn't really remember, but he's referring to it, right? And the phone call is important, it's going to come back. So, when they come back to the house that night, like, she's drunk, he's really disturbed by this, but he doesn't really tell her what happens. They just go into the house, and he sort of gets these uncanny feelings. There are all these long shots where he's like looking around, and the camera comes up really close to him and then far away. And he goes back after her and he says, I think somebody's in the house. Someone's in the house.
There's also that flash of light when they pull up to the house.
There's the flash of light, thank you, totally. The light. So you actually really are like, somebody is actually in the house, right? You believe it too. Not just he perceives it, you also see it. That's totally right. So as he goes in, don't forget, there's a phone call, right? There's a phone call, it rings twice. And as it rings twice, he goes into a daze and starts to look into the camera or something. The phone stops ringing, as if somebody picks it up. It's not him, but he's disconnected from what's happening. So you hear the phone ring twice, and then it just goes away, which sounds like this discombobulated symbol, and it doesn't make sense, right? Except that he's just had this conversation with him, and he was in the house, and he did phone, and he was there, and he did answer. So what ends up happening directly after that is they go to sleep while there's still this sense of somebody being in the house, right? The very next major symbol is he gets a videotape in the morning, and the videotape is the murder, right? The cops help move the whole plot along as well because they're investigating various portions and parts, but that's the point where the cop hits him in the face and he's like, kill her, but he says, kill her, and then he responds, tell me I didn't kill her, right? So there's all this confusion again, did I kill her, I didn't kill her, tell me I didn't kill her, and he's confused. So the very next thing is that he goes to the prison. And right here is the most important part where it starts to give you what's going to happen next, but it's nonsensical. So again, what I said about the different states of consciousness, anything having to do with consciousness, dreams, like triggers, phone calls, like anything, any portal into like a non-real dimension is like a key that something supernatural or magical is going to happen. So he goes into the prison and he starts having hallucinations. There's one key scene where he goes to the doctor, and the only conversation they have between them is the following. The doctor says, have you been sleeping? and he says, I can't sleep. And he gives him pills and he says, you'll sleep now. And so he starts to have massive like breakdown hallucinations in his cell. And it's like all this crazy filming where it's all like, the murder overlapped with everything and it's chaos. And then you have the most important symbol in the entire film. I think I'm gonna run out of okay. Then you have the most important symbol in the entire film, which is the cabin. And so the reason why this cabin is so important is because if you pay attention, the cabin is actually a phoenix resonating symbol. It doesn't explode. It actually puts itself back together from being exploded. So it's the phoenix symbol, which is everyone knows I think is the bird which rises from the ashes of its own flames. So it's the phoenix resonator. But most importantly, you don't even really need nothing to cross it out. It's much more. It's easier to just talk about the symbols, which is the second we see the cabin, the dark man comes out of the cabin and goes back in the cabin, because that's the domain of the dark man, right? And every time we see the cabin is where we see a massive plotline shift. And that's why the direct actual like film motion picture footage that he uses directly after we see the dark man come in and out is again the fast road that comes out, and then all of a sudden you have Pete. And there are flash of lights, and there's like confusion, and nobody knows what's going on. They're like, Pete, Pete, Pete. And all of a sudden, you have the guards finding him in the prison the next day. So you have the prison here, and the prison there. So the very first question that is asked to Pete, his like girlfriend, his like non-important girlfriend, soon-to-be non-important girlfriend, asks him, the most important question is, what happened to you? What happened to you? And that's going to come up. What happened to you? And he doesn't know. He's confused. His parents aren't telling him what happened. They found him in the jail. It's Gary Busey. Nobody knows what's going on. It's very like mellow. And you can see like it's like everybody's walking on eggshells and nobody knows what to say to him. But very quickly we pick the story right back up, because you have the next character, which is Mr. Eddie. Right? And he's the mechanic, sorry. And Mr. Eddie I call the boss man. And Mr. Eddie, you have a lot of different sort of background plot things happening to sort of move the story along. You see like what his life was before this incident. You see his friends. You see them going out. You see the side girlfriend. But the most important next thing that happens after he meets Mr. Eddie is that, during this time, I can't remember if it's directly before or directly after, he hears the jazz on the radio. Remember? Mm-hmm. And it's the first time that we're starting to connect back to the original plotline we were on. Is the jazz on the radio from Fred, and it bothers him. He jumps up to turn it off, and he says it's really upsetting him and it's hurting his head, right? It's disturbing him, so he shuts it off right away. But as the plot goes on, Mr. Eddie is really just about bringing us in Alice.
Is Mr. Eddie Richard?
No, Mr. Eddie's the big man, the big rich guy.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. So Alice.
Hey, Pete!
Yeah, right. I know, I was like, Richard Pryor, I forgot he was in this. Oh, it's amazing. So, she's the blonde one, and I just sort of call her the mistress, right? So, essentially, let me just make sure that. What's really funny is because I've done this so many times and I've looked at it so many times, I was able to see the first second he lays eyes on her, when she sort of jumps out of the car and his like heart is just taken by her, the mechanic, like the young guy. It's Lou Reed singing This Magic Moment, right?
Right.
It's like really great. So then, hang on a second. Oh, okay, so then during this time, as he's having this affair with Alex, he's having the tension with his girlfriend, and it's this like his new life, his old life, he's not really sure. But that's when his parents divulge to him a little bit about that night. And they start to refer to, he's having, by the way, hallucinations during this time, and he's still sort of like recovering, and he's got a head wound, and he's still like trying to piece it together. But that's when his parents tell him that there was a man with you that night. Right? And he keeps asking all the time, what's happened to me? Who is the man? Who is the man? Right? And so he keeps asking, who is the man? Who is the man, and what happened to me? And what happened to me? Okay. So, right. So then, as things progress with Alice, Alice starts to weave him into her story, which becomes about this next guy that she brings up, that she wants to rob, who is Andy the Pimp. So he re-enters the story, right? And then so Alice is talking to Pete about exactly how she knows all these guys and how she wants to rip them off to get away from them. And Pete asks Alice how she knows him, and it's an almost identical conversation to what Fred was asking his wife. How do you know him? And she says, well, I met him at Monk's, a place called Monk's, about a job. I can't remember. So, then you see the scene where she doesn't describe the scene to him, right? But she remembers in her mind the scene where she's sort of telling it like, well, he sent me up for this job and I went to see these men and they kept me there really late and I was there really, really late and I couldn't leave and, you know, they had guns and you see the scene where she's like all dressed up and they point the gun at her head and at first she's really afraid and she starts to take off her clothes, but then there's this very odd sort of nonsensical change where she starts to sort of act like she's in control and she likes it and she's all like gets to be really sultry and walks up to the guy and then sort of seems like she wants to control Mr. Eddie, so she kneels down to him and he's like all pleased and everything. So right after she tells him this story, they start making out and I think they like do it in this hotel room or something and he says, or at least they're making out or something and he's feeling sorry for her and he immediately says, right at the conclusion of the story, I love you. In the scene, the second he says, I love you, she goes, okay, great, so I'm going to call this guy and we're going to do this plan. And then she tells him, like, she has this plan memorized, and it's like, it's clear that she's already had this in her head, right? So that's right after they agree that they're going to rip this guy off, and she has the plan down, and here's how it's going to go down. I'm going to go get this guy, and you walk in the back, and then there's going to be money, and this is how it's going. He goes home to get ready to do this in the night, and the mom comes out of the house and goes, there's somebody on the phone for you. And that's where we have the Dark Man re-entering the story. And he's on the phone again, so it's like the same sort of resonator. He gets through to him on the phone and says, keeps referring like, don't you remember when I was at your house? Don't you remember that night? And so he's, again, it's this whole situation where he's just saying that he can't remember, but then he finally turns to his parents and he asks his parents again, what happened to me?
Wait, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So the Dark Man says something that is really spooky at the end of that conversation.
He does.
And he says,
the quote. Can you remember it?
It's something along the lines of like, in the East, the far East, when a man is sentenced to death, he is sent to a place where at any moment someone could shoot him in the head, in the back, something
right.
like that.
It was
and it's
so
sort of
prophetic,
nonsensical.
And I meant to write it down, but I didn't get it down.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't. It's probably. I feel like there's something even like that might be a whole like decoding process in itself. Like I'm sure it comes from somewhere, but I didn't recognize it. I don't even know if it's like biblical or something, but.
I don't know.
I'm
But
not
it,
sure,
it certainly relates back to him being on, which is Fred the Jazz Man, being on death row.
Right, it's like a prophetic. Yeah, he's. Well,
Yeah.
that's the thing is I think he's calling up to.
Sort of tie those identities together.
And also to give this prophecy, to state this thing is like, I've met you. And I got the sense that some of the questions that he was talking about, like when I was in your house, don't you remember when I was in your house? It was a little bit that thing of like, I'm in your house, I don't go where I'm not invited. So again, it's like we're getting another parallel where where this dark man is asserting to somebody who doesn't remember, like, oh no, we've met, I've been in your house. And the person's like, I don't remember, I don't know what you're talking about, you're crazy, I have no memory of this. And he's saying, oh, well, I don't go where I'm not invited, and I've met you, you just don't remember. So right at that moment, they essentially go to Andy's house, which is the pimp guy, and he sees the video of her up on the screen, and they kill Andy, right? They kill him. And this is super important, right? So here's that death on that plot line. And so as he's going through, Pete's messed up about it. She's completely fine, but he's like completely losing his mind. He's having hallucinations. He has to go to the bathroom, and he passes through this like portal because he goes through this hallway, and then it's like a bunch of sort of camera, I don't know, like he's using the camera and how he's filming to give you the mood of him going through corridors, and there seem to be there's like a little hotel that he goes through that he starts to get confused, and it's hotel room number 25. So it's number 25. So he sees this as he's like hallucinating in the hallway, right? As he's going through, as he's trying to get himself together after this murder. And as he goes through this sort of like, it feels like it's about to come, like there's like, it's about to get weird, like this is where it's like, you know, and you feel it coming. He comes back downstairs. He comes back downstairs and he sees the photograph, right, of them all together. But the most important thing about the photograph is he doesn't say like, oh look.
Can you just describe the photograph?
The photograph is all of the people together standing. It's all of the bad people. It's Mr. Eddie, the boss, Andy the pimp, Alice the blonde mistress, and Fred's wife. So we finally have like one photograph tying both of the plot lines together. But instead of asking, oh, you're twins or is that your sister? He asks, so I wrote it down, so I just want to make sure that I get it right. Oh, he asks, are both of them you? Are both of them you? Right? And she points to the blonde one and says, that's me. So what ends up happening though is they very quickly from this sort of like realization where you see, okay, all of these things are starting to draw together because we've finally seen one photograph where we at least can draw the plot lines together. They actually get in a car now. So now they're actually literally in a car, and they've literally jumped in the car, right, to go to the cabin. And she tells him finally, we are in the car, we're on the highway, and we're going to the cabin. So they're on their way back to the cabin. She basically starts to ask him about, I'm just going to put the flames on. She starts to ask him about, does he still want her? And I think they do it like at the base right here of the cabin. They have sex. And then right when she's done, she says, you'll never have me. And she disappears back into the cabin. And guess what happens? There comes Fred. Again, out of the sequence. He rises up from the sand, and he's standing there. So he's standing there at the cabin. Oh yeah. And we have the dark man is videotaping, right? So here's the videotaping coming back in. So he's got the video camera, right? So he's creating a tape. So Fred then drives to a hotel. He drives to hotel room number 25, and he sees
At the Lost Highway Hotel.
at the
right?
Lost Highway Hotel. That's right, the Lost Highway Hotel. Lost Highway Hotel. And he walks in and he sees his wife having sex with the boss man, right? And so, as the dark man watches, so enter. Let's put down the not wife. And what's his name? Oh, Mr. Eddie. Right? And then what we end up having is, I guess they're sort of on the plot line. And then what you end up having is the big one, which is Fred kills Mr. Eddie while the Dark Man watches and videotapes it. Right?
What about the knife that he kills Mr. Eddie with?
So as they're wrestling, as Fred's wrestling, there is no knife, right? He's alone in the sand. Then he reaches out and the knife appears.
But someone hands him the knife, right?
Sure, the Dark Man.
Yeah. Is that clear? I wasn't totally clear about.
If you watch again, you'll see the hand sort of put it in, but then that's not how he dies. How he actually kills him is first he cuts him and he's down on the ground, and the Dark Man has a conversation with him. And what the Dark Man does is hands him like a video player, like a little video screen. And this is another little key, because what the Dark Man shows him is a snuff film that he created. And then he says, okay, you've had enough. And he pulls it back. And then the Dark Man shoots him with a gun. But then the very next scene, there is no Dark Man, and Fred is putting the gun back in his pants. And then the very next thing he does, right? So, oh, I guess I should circle it, because that's the death on this side of the plot line. And then the very next thing he does, let me just make sure. Okay. So the very next thing he does is he drives back to his house, and he goes right up to his door, and he goes right into the voice box.